So I posted that I'd be interviewing you on my Instagram, and I got a bunch of questions, but I'm just gonna pick the one that I heard the most frequently,
Yeah.
and it had to do with whether or not you can change your body fat set point.
Yes.
So let's say, for example, you're someone who has historically had around a roughly 15 to 20% body fat. Say you're a male, you want to diet down and look a little bit leaner. So say you get down to, I don't know, 8 or 10%. Do you think that you can change that set point so that you can settle into that new leaner look?
Right. Okay, so sort of just so people are kind of clear on the terminology. The idea of a set point is that the body has some set body weight or body fat that it defends. And by defend, I mean it tries to stay at that level, right? They've shown this in animals for years. Take an animal, overfeed it, its metabolism goes up, and hunger goes down, and it kind of returns to its normal body weight. Underfeed it, metabolism goes down, hunger goes up, let it have food, and it's kind of, the example I typically use is a thermostat. Thermostat, you set your temperature. That's your set point. Go above that, AC comes on. Go below that, the heat comes on. This has been somewhat of a theoretical construct for a while. They've been arguing about this for about 30 years about whether or not it happens. Then again, they argued about whether or not metabolic adaptation existed for about 20 years too, and we know now that it does. There's another concept called a settling point, which is environmental, right? So the idea is that if I take someone who's been inactive and eating a crappy diet and I increase activity and fix their food, they will eventually, their body weight and body fat will come down and they'll settle at that new level. And this argument has been going on for years, whether there's a true set point or just a settling point. And the answer is it's both. This is the most comprehensive model, includes both, and it has to. Within a range, fairly narrow range, body weight can change, it'll tend to settle if you're a little bit more active and watching your diet, you're a little leaner and a little fatter or whatever. But once you get beyond a certain point, these metabolic adaptations kick in. These are inarguable. Every study has, the only studies that ever didn't find a real metabolic adaptation was in extremely obese people, and there's no reason for the body to really adapt, this adaptive thermogenesis. So the set point exists. Now, we might ask, well, if it exists, why do people keep getting obese? And that gets into environmental factors. Clearly, our environment, we are surrounded by cheap, tasty, easily available food. That can overwhelm any biological system that could be in place. Animals don't have access to Pizza Hut, right? And even if you give animals access to, it's called a cafeteria diet, they basically give them cookie dough, they will eat themselves till they're obese, like if you give them the equivalent of the Western diet. So that can clearly offset it. The question you're asking is, does set point ever reset itself lower? Like, let's say your set point is theoretically, your body wants to stay at 18%. Can you ever bring that down? And the answer is, probably not. Most of the studies that have ever been done looking at and it's mostly in obese people, right? Realize that researchers don't care about lean people. They don't have to. Lean people are not the problem in a public policy health standpoint. If you look at the post-obese that have been dieted down to some percentage below their previous body weight, there is some amount of metabolic adaptation that is present up to at least 7 years. It never seems to go away. There's no indication that it will ever disappear or reset itself. It seems like it can go up. Some women, they get pregnant, and for whatever reason, it never comes back off. Obesity may be able to reset it upwards, but there's really no indication that it ever resets itself in a biological sense. Now, people will point out that, yeah, but how come when you stay leaner for longer, it gets easier? That's probably behavioral. Most people, your habits are becoming so well entrenched. Your training is so consistent. Your diet is so on time. Even if you start to slip, you usually catch yourself. Because let's face it, we know, belts get a little bit tighter. But there's really, unfortunately, no indication that set point can ever come back down. So until, in no model they've ever examined, they'll start animals down and keep them there, and just the body never adjusts to that new body fat level or body weight, unfortunately.
Right. So say my body wants me to be at 180 pounds, but I like the way I look better at 165.
Right.
What am I just always going to be hungry at 165, or is there some way that I can increase my food intake once I get there to sort of offset that?
Yeah, and that's probably, what a lot of the research that looks at like exercise and weight loss finds that it typically doesn't have an enormous effect on weight loss per se, mainly because they don't give people a lot of it. Like when you give people a lot of it, 600 calories 6 days a week, that's a lot. But it really has shown its main benefit for weight loss maintenance. And I think that's a big part of it, is that first off, realize that unless you're super lean, the metabolic adaptations have been in some way overstated. Like in the obese people, you diet them down to 10% below. Their resting metabolic rate is decreased by about 50 calories. Like it's not, some people are bigger than others. And actually most of the drop in energy expenditure, most of the adaptive effect is in activity. It's because you're burning less during exercise and you tend to move around less. In the obese, it's like 75 to 90% of the total drop is in non-resting energy expenditure. It's not even resting metabolic rate that's being really impacted. So the total is like 150 calories a day, and only 50 calories of that is resting metabolic rate. Now you see bigger differences when you're dieting because leptin is lower than it would be even at maintenance. But when you come up to maintenance, all these hormones at least come back towards normal. So increasing activity offsets a big part of that decrease in whatever decrease in resting metabolic rate has occurred. But mainly it's a decrease in activity. So if suddenly you're burning 15% less calories in your aerobic exercise, well, you do a little bit more and that will offset that change. Also, by doing more exercise, you can eat physically more food, and that will help to offset that. So that's like you're not unfortunately eliminating any decrease in energy expenditure, but you are at least offsetting it with other activities so that you're not having to keep your food as constrained for as long.
Right. So yeah, increasing exercise activity, but do you think that there's any value in also trying to sort of steadily increase your food intake? So in a reverse diet, now I hosted a debate with a bunch of people, and we kind of came to the conclusion that it makes most sense just to go back to your new maintenance rather than slowly hike your way up to the new maintenance. But then once let's say you get to your new maintenance calories, do you think you can then sort of like push the envelope further with further small caloric increases to sort of mitigate hunger and increase the metabolic rate even further?
Yes and no. I've had kind of a problem with this for a little while. And reverse dieting kind of came to mean a couple of different things. One was this slow increase from your diet level back to maintenance. And I didn't have time, unfortunately, to listen to the entire debate, but it seemed like the general conclusion was, my opinion is don't take more than about 2 weeks. Like you don't have to come immediately back to maintenance because people get nutty about the water weight, but you need to start that system taking weeks and weeks and weeks to get back to maintenance. That's just weeks that you're still in a deficit. Yeah. But once you're back at maintenance and you stabilize, what you're asking is, okay, if I raise calories a little bit, will I be able to raise my energy expenditure or what have you? And there are people online that swear that this is happening. They're like, I'm maintaining at a higher level than I was before. And I think there's a couple things going on. One is that the increase in resting metabolic rate is really pretty insignificant. Like the studies they've done, they'll overfeed them like 1,000 calories a day, which is not what we're talking about exactly. Resting metabolic rate might go up 100. Like it doesn't offset anywhere near the number of calories. However, when you start to raise calories slightly, you can train harder. Yeah. And you can probably train more because you have more energy, right? People's energy just goes down the toilet when they're dieting. It sucks. I think also there's frequently an increase in that non-exercise activity thermogenesis, those other daily activities, especially if you're conscious to do it. And I think physically fit people tends to. We're not the ones that are taking the escalator or driving around the parking lot to when they go to the store. And those little things really do add up. Like I'm sure you've done a podcast on this. If not, try to get Dr. Levine in here. He's the neat guy. And basically the conclusion is you can't affect resting metabolic rate much. You can't affect thermic effect of food. Exercise for most people is a non-starter. Non-exercise activity thermogenesis, that's where it's at. Those walking treadmills. little bits add up a ton. If you can increase your daily energy expenditure by a calorie a minute at work over 8 hours, that's 500 calories a day. Like, it's really, really significant. And I think a lot of what's going on is people are training more intensely, more voluminously because they're on more calories. Their weight may be climbing very gradually. They're also probably being generally more active. And I think, in that increasing things, even if their weight is staying relatively stable. But again, it's mostly going to be, in my opinion, on the energy expenditure. I'm sorry, the activity energy expenditure end of things. Right. Burning more calories during exercise and during NEAT. So than any really effect on, metabolic rate per se.
Right.
Especially if no weight is gained. Like, if you gain weight, there was a good Lyle did a study where he overfed lean and obese people to 10% over their starting body weight. And he actually saw he saw the same adaptive thermogenic increase in energy expenditure of about 15% that you see with dieting, but they had to gain 10% of their body weight, right. Which, if you're trying to maintain, a lower weight, that's not really your goal. So yes and no.
And there seems to be massive individual variability in that as well. Some people, you can add 500 calories off the bat and they don't gain any weight. Whereas other people will retain a bunch. So.
Right, and that's genetics, and that's the classic study was they overfed a group of people 1,000 calories. Some gained like 12 kilos. It was something ridiculous, and others gained like 2. And those people moved around more. And that's hormonal genetic. It's increases in insulin and nervous system output, and there's a brain chemistry aspect of it that controls all of this. They've depressingly shown, getting back to something you brought up, the people who increase energy expenditure the most in response to overfeeding decrease it the least during dieting. Yeah. Right? So they are the most defended against weight gain, but if they gain it, it's super easy, and vice versa. The people who have the worst increase to overfeeding have the biggest decrease to dieting. So basically, you're either genetically blessed or you're genetically screwed. And to probably kind of bring this to a close, in that study, the 4 people that showed the single worst response in terms of NEAT with overfeeding were women.
Right, yeah.
Which is no surprise to anybody.
Yeah. So people who have quote-unquote slow metabolisms, so the people who have to diet on lower calories, do you attribute that mostly to NEAT?
And that's what it's really looking like. Yeah. Like, there's not huge variance in resting metabolic rate between people. There's not thermic effect of food. There's very little individual variance. Most people don't exercise, so they tend to ignore that in research. But yeah, they're finding that of total daily energy expenditure from the highest to lowest, NEAT can vary by 2,000 calories a day. Wow. And that's absurd. That's absurd. Like, that could literally double someone's energy expenditure. And some of it is certainly cultural and societal. I've found some paper, and there's one country where the women's NEAT is like triple men's, but they work on the farms and they do all the housework. In Europe, Austria, America, it's about the same. And somewhere else, the men was higher than the women. I forget where it was specifically. So a lot of that is cultural and sociological. I'm willing to bet you that people in New York have higher NEAT than people in Texas because we drive everywhere. Yeah. There is no opportunity. This is not a walking city. And cities that are set up for that, I guarantee you people get more NEAT than others, but there's a big genetic component. Some people just move around more than others, and this is all it's neurochemically mediated by things like dopamine and some other neurochemicals that some people are just, because a lot of NEAT is subconscious. You do it without even noticing it, just fissures and moving around, and it really does add up. So yeah, I think the big part of that slower fast metabolism, if you look, it's never resting metabolic rate. There's just not that much difference, unless you got someone who's like hypothyroid or hyperthyroid, like real disease states. But by and large, there's just not a big difference. Even the difference between men and women comes down, there's about a 10% difference for body weight. It comes down to the difference in body composition. Flat out, when you normalize for lean body mass, Women at most have a little bit less, but actually during the luteal phase, a little bit higher because of that progesterone metabolic effect. So yeah, I mean, there's really not much difference there. Thermic effect of food, unless you're eating a ton more, if you're exercising a lot, that's a big part of it. But I do really think it's neat. Absolutely.
Great. So Lyle, I think that would serve as a nice segue into metabolic damage. So
yes.
You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the metabolic damage theory is a little different than the metabolic adaptation idea, in that metabolic adaptation are the changes that occur as a result of the diet that you're on. Metabolic damage refers to the idea that there's somehow a carryover, there's some permanent change. So even after you might regain your weight or restore your food intake, your metabolism is somehow damaged in the sense that you now will gain weight on calories that before you might have maintained on, right?
Yeah.
Is that a bunch of crap?
Yeah. In my opinion, yes, is the short answer. Pretty much all the research I've seen, ranging from the early Minnesota study where they starved men to the limits of low body fat, their metabolisms returned to normal. Now they did gain more body fat, but that was a weird thing to do with regaining muscle mass. That's a whole different thing because they lost a ton of muscle mass. They didn't put it back on quickly enough, so their body kept driving appetite. In studies of anorexics, metabolism recovers completely. In the post-obese, it recovers completely. Admittedly, there's not a lot of data on lean people, but by and large, the only permanent changes I've seen, and these are some of the weirdest data points I've ever come across, 2 of them were in Arctic explorers. I kid you not. I don't know what it is. It was just 2 case studies, and they lost a ton of weight, and when they regained it, some aspect of their energy expenditure was like permanently 5% below normal. But here's the thing. That's trivial. Like that's, I mean, fine, it's 100 calories a day or whatever. There is another, the biosphere experiment, if you're familiar with that. It basically, they wanted to see if they could have people be self-sustaining for 2 years. And because their crops failed, it turned into a caloric restriction study. So all the men and women lost a ton of weight and body fat. And by the time they were back to normal, their NEAT was permanently reduced by 5%. And I don't have any idea why. Like, I don't have any clue why and again, it doesn't amount to a whole lot. But for whatever reason, their NEAT seemed to be permanently impaired. The studies on yo-yo dieting show no major changes in body count. Again, these are in obese individuals. Is it conceivable that it occurs in lean individuals? Maybe. Is it conceivable that potentially, I guess? But again, just the in the aggregate, I think especially anorexics, if there's a group that is screwing up their physiology, they can show up to a 30% decrease in resting metabolic. Like their system is just, cortisol can be double, 2 to 4 times normal. Like if there's a group that's completely provably screwed up physiologically, and when you refeed them to a normal weight, it all comes back to normal. So I don't know where this is coming from. It's possible that some people are predisposed to it. I have a feeling it's just, a big part of this, and this could be a big part of stalls. People are really bad at truly estimating their calories, and a lot of people that are saying they're eating X are eating X plus 30 to 80%. I don't know if that's universally the case. I would love to see these folks who go get measured, because I mean every time they've done this and someone's like, I have a slow metabolism or this and that and the other, either their food intake is 4 times what they thought it was. I mean, their metabolism is never impaired. Yeah. Now, if you add drugs to prep, I know Scott Abel's talked about this for a while, and this isn't really my area of expertise. Like, I've heard that it's possible to permanently impact thyroid metabolism if you abuse it for too long at too high of a dose. I know there's some evidence that male steroid abusers may permanently impact the gonadal axis and may end up hypogonadal. In terms of what limited research is available on, lean, non-drug using folks that are starved and refed, I've seen no indication that there's a permanent change.
Yeah, I know that Lane Norton has alluded to some research done in rats that refers to like a cellular memory model. So it's like the fat cell can sense that it's been in a deficit before. But it hasn't been carried out in humans, right? To my knowledge.
Yeah, and that, I'm like I said, and while they haven't done that kind of study in humans in terms of at the biological level, observationally, just the difference hasn't been seen. Because they've done it. There was one, and admittedly it was one woman, and they followed her through 3 different diet studies and weight regain. Like, dieted her, she got fat again, dieted her, and there was no change in body composition. There was no fundamental change in really in anything. I mean, I guess there could be a difference. Like, let's say you diet down, you lose a ton of muscle, and when you gain the weight back, you don't gain all the muscle back. That would have a small impact, but pound of muscle burns about 6 calories, so like, it's not an enormous amount. Honestly, from a so if it changed body composition, potentially it could have that effect. Even so, even if the fat cells have a cellular memory, I don't see how that's impacting metabolism. I don't see how that's having a direct effect. Leptin levels return right back to where they were. I just, again, the stuff I've seen looking directly at metabolic rate in humans doesn't support it, and rat models often show some very distinct differences. So, like I said, I'm willing. I would love to see it. I would love to see, some more direct metabolic measurements of super lean bodybuilders. There's a couple of case studies that have been done, but everything seems to kind of return back to normal when they get fat again.
Yeah. So, in terms of rates of gains here, so is it your impression that however long it takes for the weight to go back on, once it's back on, the metabolic rate should be back to where it was pre-diet?
That's pretty much what the research shows. I mean, unfortunately, because of the set point thing, like, you do have to gain the body fat back, and until that happens, and that was that weirdness in that Minnesota study where they ended up gaining more fat than they started with. What it looks like is there's different signals being sent to the brain. Body fat is a big one because of leptin, but muscle is sending some unknown signal to the brain regarding hunger. They don't know what it is yet. And what it looked like was happening was, so on the way down, they lost a ton of muscle and all the fat. On the way back, they were gaining fat, but the muscle was coming back on slowly. They didn't get back to 100% normal till their muscle had been recovered, at which point appetite, and it was all driven by appetite anyway, like their appetite stayed up. So yes, they regained more body fat, but that gets back to the point. You have to limit muscle loss on a diet. Sufficient protein and resistance training. By the same token, when you're refeeding, if you keep protein high and resistance train, any muscle lost will come back on so that you end up at the same body composition, right? And that one case study of the male bodybuilder, like, his energy expenditure cratered, like, he got to contest level, like here, and then he regained, and as soon as he hit his initial body fat, it all balanced out.
Everything was fine,
Yeah. So again, is there the potential some individual, just for whatever reason, some physiological aspect of them cracks? I suppose, but I'm of the, when you hear hooves, think horses kind of model, that the human research, just other than that weird little drop in meat, unless or Arctic explorers, I just haven't seen it. So, but I'm willing to change my opinion if I do.
Yeah. And on the Minnesota starvation study, one of the arguments I hear for not gaining the weight back quickly is that it does take your muscle a long time to rebuild after the diet.
Sure.
So you want, say, the rate of fat gain to sort of match the rate of muscle gain, so you don't look like pudgy for a couple months or whatever.
Sure.
But what I would just really quickly, what I would say to that is that, like, the subjects in the starvation study weren't resistance trained, whereas contest dieters are, obviously, and so I think that they would be more susceptible to a muscle memory response.
Absolutely.
Right, so they would gain the muscle back way faster in a reasonable surplus than the starvation subjects would. So
no, absolutely, and the starvation subjects weren't resistance training on the way back up either. So whatever was being put back on, because other research has shown, like, again, mostly in the post-obese, that even if you do nothing but keep protein intake high, right? It's taken 30 years for obesity researchers to finally realize, we should have higher protein on a diet. If you just simply do that, a larger proportion of the weight gain is in lean body mass, because your body's like it or not, overfeeding is anabolic in its own right, even without training. So if you're getting enough protein, some of that will be laid down as muscle. That gets that peer. So I think if you're looking at physique athletes who are training of any sort, they will have a muscle memory effect.
Yeah.
Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying, to get fat. And this is where I think people get a little bit confused. Like gaining some fat when you're in a gaining phase or regaining body fat after a diet does not mean get fat. And I'm not saying you should be, but if you're at 4% as a male or 10% as a female, you're going to feel like crap until you're not going to get anything near normal hormones levels till you're, male 8 to 10%, female 16 to 18%. And again, there's going to be recommendations in the book specifically of, there's differences. If you're just a female dieting to 18%, here's how you should stay there. But if you've dieted down to 10%, you're going to need to regain some body fat in the first 4 to 6 weeks to get things back to normal. And then you can start a more gradual build. But nothing is going to recover until your calories are back towards maintenance. On any level. And women have the issue of if they've lost their menstrual cycle or have any level of menstrual cycle dysfunction, they have to reverse that because they are losing bone density.
Right.
Period. Like that's just the reality of it. And it can still take 3 to 5 months for the menstrual cycle to resume after it's been lost. And the faster, and at least in monkey models, the more calories you put in, the faster it comes back. And again, I'm not saying they need, should gorge and binge. They need to bring the calories up to at least predicted maintenance and then start a gradual regain of body fat. But it can't take, and we're not looking at a ton. A small female, you're only still looking at a pound of fat gain a week. Like it doesn't have to be because she's only lost 15 pounds of fat anyway. It's not like we're looking at a tremendous amount. She didn't come down 30 pounds. Same thing for a male. To get a male from 4 to 8% body fat is not an enormous fat gain, but at least once they're getting some relatively normalized hormones, they can start to stabilize again.
Right. So now I'd like to move on to just general training recommendations. So I'm going to quote you again here. You recently wrote, I think within the context of the research, I think it was out of Brad Schoenfeld's lab, where he had one group do something like 7 sets of 3, and he had another group do 3 sets of 10, volume equated, saw similar hypertrophy. So based on that, I think you said, and the general conclusion was that the idea is that there's some specific hypertrophy range of 6 to 15 reps or whatever isn't correct. So long as volume is matched, the effects are roughly the same.
They seem to be, yeah.
And this has led to, this is quoting you, this has led to what I consider to be a silly idea, which is that volume is the most important factor in growth.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
The context on that, like I part of me, this is partly me being pedantic, but partly me being serious, is that I think the idea that it's like, there's this single most important, if there's a single most important factor to growth, it's progressive tension and getting stronger over time. I think the idea that, clearly, no matter how much volume you do without sufficient intensity, you won't grow.
Right.
If anything, with sufficient intensity, low volume, you will grow. Maybe not well, but, same thing. We've got the triangle of frequency, intensity, and volume. And I think pretending that any one of them is singularly more important, that's the problem I have with that idea. Just because I think it leads down a rabbit hole of, as long as the volume is right, none of these other factors are important. Again, it's probably me being pedantic. I took issue with somebody over, there's the whole time under tension idea that's been kind of fallen out of favor. And his comment was, well, if time under tension, it was all that mattered, endurance athletes. And I'm like, okay, that's not what anybody ever meant. Even when it was first kicked around, it meant time under high tension. I actually saw Mel Sith make that argument, which really disappointed me. But time under high tension doesn't make nearly as cool of an acronym. So and same thing, I'm sure within the context of this, saying that volume is the most important factor, that's true assuming intensity is at a sufficient level and frequency is a sufficient level, and I realize this is kind of an argument, an absurd extremist argument, but it's like, okay, well, if all that matters is volume, well, I can do 9 sets 4 times, every week, or why don't I just do 36 sets once a month? Right. I know nobody's arguing that, and this is me just being me, which is so to speak, a pedantic ass, but that's kind of where that's coming from. I think it, without considering the other variables, I think same reasons, like, you've got the high frequency advocates who are like, train squat every day and train 6 days a week, and it's like, well, we need to find a balance of all these factors.
Yeah, and then you still do have the high intensity crowd who really think that volume maybe isn't quite as important as taking sets to failure.
Yeah.
And I think it's fallen out of flavor in like the mainstream evidence-based crowd or whatever, but there are still its proponents within the scientific community. So what do you think is the role of failure in that triangle? Because you said volume, intensity, frequency. How important is how hard you're working?
I think within limits, I mean, clearly you have to pass a certain critical intensity. Although Brad's done that work where low intensity, 35 reps to failure seem to cause growth too. It sucks. It's the worst work you'll ever do, but clearly that does work. That's a little bit different. What you're asking about is the idea of failure, right? The high intensity training advocates define intensity very differently than everyone else. To them, intensity is going to limits.
Yeah.
Is training until you cannot move the bar anymore. They're not using a more traditional intensity definition of percentage of weight on the bar, whatever. And that's been around forever. And it was really, and I don't know if Arthur Jones started it, but he certainly popularized it. And it was almost a logical argument of, well, if you don't go to failure, you can't know how hard you're working. And I'm sorry, but that's just BS, right? We've got plenty, RPE scales, like all of that stuff. And other people have made the argument, here's the thing. You've gone to what you think is failure. If I put a gun in your face, you'll get another rep, right? Most true failure, whatever, back and forth and back and forth. Yeah. And the question then becomes, is failure required for growth? Well, absolutely not, because guys have grown without it for decades. Clearly, it is not required. We can ask, is it optimal for growth? And I think that becomes another one of those it depends issues. From a practical standpoint, if you're going to use an RPE scale, rating of perceived exertion, or I will recommend, go 1 to 2 reps short of failure. Well, if you've never actually trained to your limits, you don't know what that means. Mm-hmm. You don't know what failure is. You don't know what 2 reps short of failure is. Yeah. So I think from a practical standpoint, spending some time going to failure teaches you that. It also teaches you that you can probably push a lot harder than you think you can. Mm. As far as using it regularly in training, I think it can become problematic in that it can be really physically and mentally exhausting going to failure. That's assuming you can do it in proper form anyway. Like one of the arguments I would even make to the pro failure people, how many people have you ever seen take a set of squats to true failure? I don't mean hard. I mean to the point where they get stuck in the middle of a rep and then lower the bar and get pinned. How many? Damn fair few. Yeah, fine. If you're on a leg press, whatever, still don't see it very often. You don't see it, same thing with deadlifts, you don't see it very often, and people progress just fine because it's not very safe on a lot of movements. The research is mixed, it's depends on if you're looking at strength or growth or short-term versus long-term. There was one study that compared failure and non-failure. It was like upper body was different than lower body and they actually did, it was a really intelligent study where it was like a block of training and then a peaking to a testing type of thing, like really more real world training. I think the failure worked better for bench and worse for squat for lower body, and I don't remember the details of it. From a more practical standpoint, I think it interacts with volume. If you're only doing one set, you should probably go to failure, because that's your one set to get anything out of. If you're doing multiple sets of an exercise, many people find that if they take that first or second set to failure, it crushes the rest of the sets. Whereas you might have been able to do 4 sets of 8 if you stayed less to failure. If they do 10 in the first set, they go to 6, 5, 4. Like it crushes their volume. That's very individual. I had a training partner, if he took a set too hard into failure, it would wreck the entire workout for him. Admittedly, he had 20 years of training and he could generate intensity like most people can't. For him, and I don't know, nervous system fatigue, I don't know what was going on, but I have seen that before. So I think the general consensus among the evidence-based crowd is failure has its place, but sparingly. One way I like to use it practically in the gym is, let's say you've got 4 sets of 10 programmed. And this is really more bodybuilding. Powerlifters don't really do this because it's not safe. They work by RPE. They grind every once in a while. But I'm talking really about bodybuilding here. So let's say you've got 4 sets of 8, and the idea is that you should be a couple reps short of failure. Well, you do 3 sets of 8, and go ahead, take that 4 sets failure. just because it'll tell you where you are. Because frequently you just kind of, you start lollygagging and you do that, and guess what? If you got 12 reps on that last set, it's time to raise the weight. Like, I think I think using it like that every once in a while, just as a progress metric, can be a good idea. But I think it does tend to burn people out. I know some of the early does the daily undulating periodization, where they're doing different reps every day, but pretty much every day was a maximum. They all tended to burn out pretty quickly. Yeah. Like they would overreach and overtrain after about 4 to 6 weeks. So it can really take its toll on the body. So yes, it has its place, but don't overuse it like so many things.
Right. What do you think of, say, so that is an argument I hear a lot, is that for, if you're going to take too many sets to failure, then your volume is going to be compromised because you're not going to be able to do as many reps on subsequent sets.
Yes.
So why not take that hit and then do, say, like a drop set or a strip set? Or whatever.
Yeah, but that is certainly a one way of going about it, and that gets into theoretical arguments. Yeah. Well, what's more important? Weight on the bar, number of reps. If you're fatigued and you drop the weight by 10%, is the stimulus to the muscle less than if you kept the weight? It's a straight sets across versus, like, I know Martin Birkin called it reverse pyramid training. Yeah. Poliquin was recommending this years ago, and I have too. I think once you've been training for a while, I recommend warming up, jumping to your top set. If you can stay there, stay there. If you want to drop the weight back, drop the weight back. I think those all are potentially valid. I think it might, some of it's individuality of the lifter. If you're a lifter that going to failure means no matter how much you drop the weight, you're still losing a ton of reps, then it's probably not good for you. Right. Some people are really good at that. It's a nervous system thing. Some people are great at repeating sets across, and other people, I don't care how limited it is, they're just not going to get it done. Mm-hmm. Probably depends on the exercise, biomechanics, like all that other sort of stuff. Yeah. Like even me personally, right? I've got in my training right now, I'm kind of built to squat, so I can do repeat sets of squats, no problem. But I've got long monkey arms, and my triceps have already been always been really limiting. So if I try to do 4 sets of 8 in any compound chest exercise, it will go down the toilet by set 3. So practically what I've done is I'll do like 2 heavy sets of a compound chest, move to 2 sets of an isolation exercise, move back to 2 heavy compound sets, and then finish with 2 sets of isolation. So I split my volume up because that takes out a limiting factor for me. Someone who's built to do compound chest exercises might be able to do that 4 sets of 8, or do, start with a set of 10 to failure, drop it 10%, depending on how many reps they drop. So yeah, I think both are definitely potentially valid. I think you still have the issue of failure training eventually just really wearing people out. You have to just get really pumped up and motivated, and it can be kind of exhausting after a while.
Right. And do you think that there's some sort of threshold? Like, in my experience, when people are leaving like 5-6 reps in the tank, it's like they're not stimulating enough to really maximize their growth. So I would say like maybe like RP 8 or 9 if your goal is hypertrophy, and then, like you said, take the last one to failure if you feel.
No, absolutely. Like, I think I know like Mike Toucher and some of the RPE guys, like they'll do the ones that are like a 5-6 RPE. It's usually speed work. It's it's deload week. It's a way to get a lot of good technical volume and submaximal volume, which for powerlifting, very different sport. You're looking at some very different demands. You can't, especially when you're lifting heavy weights, it's very exhausting on the body. And I know he does a lot of waving. I agree with you completely. I think for hypertrophy purposes, leaving 5 reps in the tank is pointless. I don't think that does. It's a good warm-up set. I don't think that's an even remotely useful way to train.
Yeah. And then,
so yeah, I would probably say 1 to 2 reps in the tank max.
Yeah. And then in terms of actual volume recommendations, what do you think of Wernbaum's recommendation of 40 to 70 reps? I guess more popularly, Eric Helms has made this recommendation too. I think it's 40 to 70 reps per workout or per body part, and then you do that 3 times a week or 2 to 3 times a week. So the total reps would be, I don't know, some range that's
it's somewhere between like 80 and 210 per week or something like that. Yeah, that's what I've been using that for a lot of years, and that's really for. Again, he and I argue about this constantly, or discuss this rather, and that is really kind of an intermediate level. At the advanced, I think he's more flexible with volume, but it depends on the person. I know his excellent training pyramid book. He talks about kind of the way he uses to decide when it's time to up volume, because at some point you may have to. I think for most people, if they're working intensely, I think that's a perfectly. I think most people do far too much volume. Now, fine, and I've traditionally, I've not been a big fan of the hammer it once a week type of thing, but clearly Brad's work showed that it can work. Yeah. I think if you do enough volume and work intensely, I think that's where people went wrong. You had guys just pumping it up for a day, and that just doesn't do squat without drugs. 40 to 70 reps, if you're looking at 8 to 12, that's a good 4 to 8 sets. And I think if you look through a lot of empirically demonstrated systems that work, that's about right. Hell, you can go back to the old Bill Starr 5x5. He did 5x5 and then allowed up to 40 reps of beach work. Well, that's 25 and 40 is 65. Lee Haney recommended 8 sets of 8. And you see that number seems to crop up a lot. And again, I think the research is there. If you look at that relationship, that's kind of where things are optimized. More work doesn't get you more growth. Right. It is interesting that even with those studies, low volume does generate some growth. That's not debatable. One set to failure clearly does generate growth. However, I think if you look in the aggregate from both the strength and growth standpoint, there is an optimal volume for growth or strength or whatever. And it tends to be, like they've done studies in Olympic lifters and swimmers, that moderate volumes work better than high and low volumes. There's an optimal stimulus per workout or per week or whatever, what have you. I think they do too much. I think they do too many redundant exercises. I think they do too much overlap. You watch a guy do flat bench, flies, dumbbell bench, dumbbell flies, incline bench, incline flies. It's like, dude, those are all the same exercise. Women, again, do endless leg work at sort of sub-intensity. And I think most people, pick 2 or 3 quality exercises. Some body parts need 2, chest, legs may need 3, back frequently needs 3. Get out, please. I think for most people, that's, unless they're at a very advanced level, is probably pretty good. Like I said, I know Eric will use that, and when somebody stops progressing in strength or whatever, he'll go ahead and bump that up because they're probably ready for a higher stimulus. Yeah, I think for most people, that's about right.
So Lyle, I was also wondering your thoughts on the so-called volume trap. Do we need to take a break?
No, we're fine. He does this every time. So. Okay. Get down, please.
So I was wondering your thoughts on the so-called volume trap, or also the maximum recovery or maximum recoverable volume. Some people will jump their volume up really quickly rather than progressively making their way up in volume, and then it's what do you do at that point once you're there? Do you just add more volume? And so, right, and
it's kind of like the calorie thing. I'm of the opinion is that you should find the lowest volume and frequency that will give you the gains that you want. And if you look at the progression levels of most elite athletes, if you look at how they train, swimmers, runners, cyclists, it takes them 10 years to get to the volume they're using now. Swimmers start with 3 days a week. Year later, they had a 4th day a week. Then they had a double day. By the time they're in high school, they're training 12 times a week. But like you said, if you jump your volume up or jump your frequency, okay, when that stops working, when you've accommodated to that, now what? And I realize, and this will sound bitter and cynical, but it's just true. Here's the reality. Most people who do this stuff, at best, will get past suck. It's just reality. It's not meant, I never had great genetics, still don't. But the reality is that, look, you can spend all the time you want training. You're never going to be much better than that. You can get good and stuff, but go do something else. If you're at if you're a high level athlete, if you're making that kind of progress, that's fine, but still do it in steps. The body can adapt to things. Every time you do that, it's a huge stress to the system. And unless you're doing, shock microcycles or doing 2 weeks of super volume to just exhaust yourself so that you can then super compensate. But if you're looking at long-term development, it needs to be a gradual process. Beginners, you start with 1 set, 2 or 3 times a week, build up to 3, stay there for a while, then you're increasing, at the 6-month mark as you become an intermediate. It needs to become a gradual thing. I think a lot of people that probably are doing that, again, they're just not working at a particularly decent intensity. Because, I mean, the reality is if you're working hard for 8 sets, you shouldn't be able to do much more. You know, when I was more married to lower volume training, like I remember some guy and he was like, "Oh, I can do all this work," and I put him through a set of 20 rep squats, and I was like, "All right, what else would you like to do for legs?" He's like, "Nothing." I'm like, right, that's kind of the point here, that yes, you need some volume, but quality, you need enough quality too, and there's only so much quality work you can get done.
Right. So that brings me to the topic of training frequency. So I'll just focus on bodybuilding here because I think it's a little different for powerlifting. We won't get into that.
I agree.
So for bodybuilding purposes, I think it's fairly standard to recommend 2 to 3 times per week training frequencies for naturals. However, you know, of late it's becoming more trendy to train more frequently than that. I did an interview with Menno Henselmans, and I think he's had some of his athletes train as many as 5 or 6 times a week, and in some cases even 2-a-days with some of his women athletes. So do you think that there's any merit to increasing your training frequency past a point, or what do you make of all that?
I think the question comes down to, like, you know, we've got sort of a distributed versus concentrated volume model. And by that, I mean, you're doing X weekly volume. Say you're doing 10 sets. You could do 2 sets 5 days a week. You can do 5 sets twice a week. You can do 10 sets once a week, like whatever, that, you know, assuming you're doing a fixed volume. I think you find that there is a minimum threshold to stimulate any sort of adaptation. I think that's the key thing. Now, do we know what it is? Okay, fantastic. Maybe 1 set is enough if you're going heavy enough. I know, you know, that I don't know, it's funny, that training runs in cycles and has for decades, and we go from intensity to volume to frequency, back and back again, and this kind of comes through. I know part of that is coming out of, you know, the Norwegian powerlifting study, this kind of very informal thing they did with an, you know, elite Norwegian powerlifting team. And yeah, some of them gain more muscle training 6 days a week versus 3. I believe there was an interview with that coach who still said he would train less frequently with more volume, despite those results. So yeah, I mean, it can be done. I think from a practical standpoint, there's just the reality that most people have a life, and there's a limit to how much they can do. I think another thing that's often forgotten in all of this, in terms of the frequency issue specifically, is the one tissue that wears out the most, that nobody pays any attention to, is connective tissue, right? Muscles, whatever, they can recover as quick, you know, however quickly, depending on how much and how often you're training them. Tendons, ligaments, those take forever to adapt. Runners find this out the hard way. When they go from 3 days a week to 6, they get hurt if they don't do it very, very, very progressively. I think that's an unconsidered aspect in this. If you're, you know, it has to be done very gradually if it's going to be done at all. But I have to wonder, you know, what those workout. It's like, okay, are we just going in and doing 2 sets per body part? Because if you're doing full body 5 times a week, clearly you're not doing a whole lot of volume. There is some interesting stuff on, you know, 2-a-day training in endurance sports, and again, Hakkinen has shown that, you know, female Olympic lifters seem to gain better if they split their volume up across 2 days. Again, Olympic lifting is a very different thing than bodybuilding. I know there was some current concern at one point that as lifters get more advanced, the increase in protein synthesis isn't as long of a duration. Which is actually funny. The tradition in bodybuilding has been the more advanced you get, the less frequently you should train. And it's almost, you can almost make an argument that that's reversed, because if your muscles are not growing as free, you know, as long from a given amount of training as you get more advanced, to continue to get growth, you do almost need to train more frequently up to a point. Does it need to be train the same muscle group every day or twice a day? You know, I've even written about 2-a-day training the same muscle group twice a day, but still only like twice a week. So yeah, I mean, I guess if you've determined someone can recover from it or whatever, I think, again, for most people, it probably, just from a practical reality standpoint, most people can't train like that. Their schedule simply won't allow it. But yeah, you do get surprised to get some nice overlapping gene expression type of stuff going on. I still wonder, you know, are you going to be able to surpass some critical volume or intensity threshold per workout
per session,
to really stimulate those kind of adaptations, but without seeing exactly what's being set up.
Yeah. How much weight do you think we should be putting in that muscle protein synthesis research? I mean, like, how strongly has that been shown to be linked to actual hypertrophic outcomes? I think is pretty scant at this point.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's like, and there's actually a paper that just came out, although it was like they tracked multiple protein synthesis over 6 hours, and that didn't correlate with growth in the long term. And I'll be honest, at this point, like, I've been so entrenched in the women's stuff, I haven't been able to keep, Brad Schoenfeld's probably the man to talk to about this particular topic. But it's actually a really good question, is that these acute hypertrophic responses, there's always the question of, does this really translate over into the long-term gains? And I don't know that that's always necessarily been shown. And it does kind of raise some interesting questions. I mean, the problem, growth is ultimately a very long-term response, a remodeling of the muscle and kind of all that tissue. So is focusing on that one specific pathway to the exclusion of the rest? But I can't claim to have kept up with that particular literature enough to give you an intelligible answer. But I think it is a really good question if that's really what we should be focusing on here. I mean, like I said, I'm of the opinion that if you want to get into a single most important factor, it's progressive tension overload. Like, that's what it comes down to. We've known this since the 70s. Mechanism of work-induced hypertrophy. We know that the key to building a bigger muscle is you have to progressively tension overload it. The biggest natural bodybuilders are always strong, period. And guys that are not strong do not get big unless they take drugs, and in which case it stops mattering. But that, and then it just becomes, finding the frequency, intensity, volume that will allow you to do that over time. So I tend to think of that more than, the acute stuff is interesting, but I don't know, like you said, if it's going to completely translate over.
Yeah,
I'd love to hear Brad's response to that.
Yeah, I'm having him on this month, so I'll make sure I bring that up. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'd love to.
All right, Lyle. So so that covers all the questions that I had for you, and I think we did a good job of getting into a lot of details with that. So I really appreciate your time and for all the details that you provided. Before you go, I'll just give you a quick chance maybe to plug any places where people can find you, maybe give us some details on when we can expect that book to drop. I know I'll be buying it.
Okay. Best place to find, all my articles. All my articles, I've got like 500 plus of them now. Bodyrecomposition.com, spelled exactly how it sounds. You can also get there by lylemcdonald.com. I do have a Facebook group that's very active, and there's actually some really Brad's in there, Alan Aragon is in there. We've got some really smart people posting in there. That's very active. I'm of course on Facebook. That's pretty much it. I tried doing YouTube videos, and it was too much of a pain in my butt to get them done, so I stopped doing that. But as far as the women's book, like, it is in progress, and I hate to give scheduled release times because I always miss them. It's taking a lot longer than I thought, because I think your listeners got an idea of just the level of complexity of this. I'm grinding through a lot to go back and add a ton of information on menstrual cycle dysfunction that took a lot of time. So sometime this year is just kind of the best thing I can say. Like, I wish it were done earlier, because I know folks are about to start their contest prep, but it's the way this project has become. It'll kind of be done when it's done. So, but trust me, everybody will know when it is.
Sure. And I think there were a lot of really useful tidbits. I know even myself as a coach, I learned a lot from this conversation. So I think that if people are looking for practical takeaways, I think you offered a lot of them here. So thanks for that.
Very good.
So guys, that's going to conclude this episode of the Ice Cream for PRs podcast. If you're listening on iTunes, don't forget to subscribe. If you're watching this on YouTube, click the like button below and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interviews exactly like this one. Lyle, thank you once again for your time, and we'll see you guys next time.